Welcome to the ISTEP Network podcast. We provide real-world insight into complicated sustainability topics.
Hear from frontline practitioners and experts.
This week's topic is Scope 3 is a beast. Let's dive into the discussion.
Hi, Ben, and welcome to ISTEP's first live podcast. Today, we are going to be diving into a topic that keeps sustainability professionals up at night, which is Scope 3 is a beast and how do you actually get started? The reality is, Scope 3 emissions account for more than 80% of most companies' total footprint. Yet, despite their scale, they remain the hardest to track, measure, and report. And taming this beast can feel like an impossible task, but with regulations tightening globally and stakeholder expectations at all-time high, it is no longer something that companies can just think about because they're under a pressure to act. I'm Jyoshitha, a sustainability analyst at Fosterra and a host for ISTEP Network events. Last year, I finished my master's in sustainability and management from University of Bath. And as a recent entrant to the field, Scope 3 is a topic that I interact with our clients, and I find it fascinating how much impact you can create by measuring and tracking it. We're also joined by Ben Foster, CEO of Fosterra, who brings real-world experiences of navigating the Scope 3 challenges firsthand. We have also gathered inputs from the front line, Ash Sparks from New Belgium Brewery, and 𝐒𝐿_king from Coca-Cola Northeast, who recently completed their Scope 3 inventory. We're going to have a really interesting deep dive into things that are happening today to help address the needs of the oil companies. Welcome, Ben. Would you like to tell us a bit more about yourself first?
Great, thank you. Hi, I'm Ben Foster, founder and CEO of Fosterra LLC, and I'm happy to have this conversation today with you, Jyoshitha, and to share stories from two guests. I've been working in this field for 20 years now, before Scope 3 was even a serious area of focus, and I've led efforts to make a real impact with companies that wanted to tackle this challenging area, including Cliff Bar, division of Mondelez, and leading brands within the Unilever portfolio. I think that sharing the highs and lows in a forum like this is important to me because there are lots of lessons learned that can help make it easier for others. So thanks for listening.
Thank you, Ben. I'm looking forward to all the things that you have learned and picked up in the 20 years you have been in this field. So I'd like to start by asking you, why do we see Scope 3 gaining importance today?
Well, I think as you mentioned in the intro, Scope 3 by far has the greatest contribution to total GHG emissions, and yet it's the hardest really to impact on your own. So I'm going to share a couple of slides here that help to illustrate that. This is one from CDP or stats from CDP from a few years ago that really show the relative ratio or importance and contribution of GHG emissions from Scope 3, that's your supply chain, versus Scope 1 and 2. So as you can see, retail by far, it ends up being about 96, 97% of their total emissions, which makes sense because of all the products that they buy and distribute. But down even in manufacturing and hospitality, those ratios mean that 85+% of their emissions total emissions come just from supply chain or all the things that aren't directly within their control. So I think that's super important just to keep in mind that this is always going to be something important and something challenging. And so that's why you might hear that the range of Scope 3 is 85 to 95%, and that applies to most different industries. Now, I think one more thing I want to point out is that Scope 3 is not one big thing. It's 15 little things or 15 categories within that. And these are defined by the GHG protocol, as most of you probably listening to this would already know. And so those are broken into upstream and downstream categories. And what's important is that each one of these can be very different in terms of the methods or the information that's needed based on your industry. If you're making heavy machinery versus like that retail type of operation that you saw in the prior slide, what your impact's going to be in each one of these areas and what your operations look like are going to vary. So as we talk through this, it's important to keep in mind that we may use Scope 3 interchangeably sometimes with supply chain, but it really can mean a lot of different things.
That's really interesting when you mentioned that there's an increased focus in reducing carbon intensity across value chain, and that's one of the reasons why Scope 3 is gaining importance today. So as a follow-up, I would like to ask you, would you say companies are already seeing the consequences of not measuring their Scope 3 emissions, or they're yet to, realize it?
That's a great question. In terms of realizing Let me back up for a minute. There are absolutely consequences of not understanding that. Whether they realize it or not, that's sort of a different question, and I think those are both important. As we saw, what's happening in your supply chain is what's happening to your business. If you don't understand scope three, you don't understand your business. You don't understand what's happening across the whole value chain, whether it's customers and downstream or upstream and suppliers. So there's a real operational component to it and insight that can be gathered. And so if you don't see that, then you're missing something in terms of operational impact. Now, whether they realize it or not, I think what's happening is as regulations are coming in, whether it's in the EU and UK or in certain states in the US or other markets around the country, around the world, where they are starting to say, you need to measure that. You need to understand what's happening. You need to understand the risks in your supply chain. Then that realization comes to focus that, wow, we didn't know that this particular area in scope three was such a big challenge for us or something that has a big impact. So I think it's becoming more obvious as they begin to dive in.
And like, would you say as a what like the impact that you make on scope by measuring scope 3 is widely spoken about, right? But what is that impact that you can create by measuring scope 3 and reporting scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, I think the the funny thing is in the short term, not much because you have to rely on third parties, and whether it's your suppliers or your logistics providers or your end customers and the nature of how your product is made, you can't change that on a dime, right? If you're successful and you're growing and you have a market share and you have all that value chain figured out, you can't say, well, next year we want to reduce our GHG emissions by 20% in our supply chain. That would be probably pretty hard to do. But it's a long-term effort. And so the thing is that understanding how to prioritize is the most important thing first, I think, because then you know where to put your effort. If you put all your effort into one area that won't really move the needle, then you've spent a ton of time to try to figure that out. Whereas on the other hand, if you can say, well, these are the areas not only where we have a big footprint across those 15 areas, somewhere in there, and where we can actually have an impact, like maybe working directly with suppliers or finding alternate logistics. So I think it's a long-term effort. I think that's something that's important to keep in mind.
Hmm. I think speaking of long-term effort, I think, oftentimes when we discuss about scope 3 emissions, especially when we are discussing about the categories that involve you to interact with suppliers, I remember you highlighting how it drives behavioral change across the organization, across down your supply chain. So can you expand a bit on that for our listeners and tell us about if there's any example that you've come across where you've seen that behavioral change happen firsthand?
Yeah, Joshua, that's a great question. I love having this conversation with you about this topic. It's really this is change management ultimately. I think largely is that the solutions that are needed are mostly known. The the path forward to get to those solutions is defined, has been tried. There are companies that are yeah, that are leaders in different areas. Um, but changing from what we're doing today, a company that's been around for 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, they can't just say, well, we're going to do it differently tomorrow because somebody told us to, or someone else is doing it a different way. So I think largely it's a change management skill is how do you help people understand that there is a better way. It is possible to pursue that other way, and you can be successful, right? To try to de-risk that. I think one example that comes to mind, especially when you're dealing with folks across an organization that the sustainability thing they haven't really thought of before is waste. Now,
Hmm.
waste is something that every company looks to reduce because that to them indicates something that they bought that then they have to throw out, right? It's something that's wasted either because the quality coming in wasn't sufficient or the manufacturing process, something happened, or on the way out the door, something happened to the product. And so that's super important for them to focus on. But waste is a sustainability lever as well. It's huge because all of that material that went into making the product, all the energy and fuels that went into making that product, all the transportation, all the labor, all the downstream, then you have to pay to dispose of it and becomes manufacturing waste, which happens to be category five in scope three. Those are all things that you have to add up and you have to tally up and you have to include. So typically, if we talk about waste as a way in, that light bulb starts going off. Like we're focused on waste, but there's a huge sustainability benefit as well as a business benefit. That's what sort of what I was talking about before in that overlap between operations and
Hmm.
sustainability. So I think that's really the interesting thing is that if you talk about waste as a way in, we're already focused on that, but measure the sustainability dimension, then that's one way to help start down that path that we can do these things in a way that's different.
Yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, like I think it reminded me of something else that we used to discuss about, like using the language when we interact with people to gather such related data. If you talk about in terms of sustainability, it's also oftentimes they wouldn't understand its importance or why it's relevant to them. But yeah, flipping that switch and saying why it's important for the whole business, it makes them think through it in a
Yeah,
more in a more, intentional way.
I think you're right.
Uh, so great answers. I would like to circle back to the title of this podcast for a minute here. We now you've touched upon like why scope 3 is important, its impacts of like good things about measuring it, but why is it so hard to measure? Why is a scope 3 a beast?
Yeah, the beast. I love the title of this, and Jyoshitha, I think you were part of the inspiration of coming up with that. So appreciate the thinking. It is tough. Whether you've done it once, it's your first time through, or your 10th time through, and you'll hear that from a couple of our guests that we spoke with earlier this week. That it's there's always something new. There's always something different. It's always something unique or a challenge. So I think overall, when we look at it. It's this 15 armed beast, right? These 15 different categories, and trying to sort out what to do and how to do it. And because you have to rely on others as a sustainability professional, even if you had a team of two or three, which is probably unlikely, but even if you did, you wouldn't have access to nearly all the information you need. So just trying to get it and as we just mentioned, you have to explain to everyone else what it is, what you're going to use it for, why it's important, what's going to happen once you get the data. These are all things that make it more challenging.
So, what is the one that they struggle the most with? Is it, getting the data in from internal departments or from suppliers, or knowing where to start, or is it something else differently? I know you mentioned a number of different reasons why it's a beast, but is there anything in particular which they struggle the most with?
Yeah, I think starting with the things that are closest to you are easiest, right? Things you may already be
Mm,
measuring, you may already have some information on. For instance, there are a few of the scope 3 categories that are derived from scope 1 and 2, information you maybe already have. So those are easier because those are things that you may already be in possession of the activity data you need. I know you asked what's hardest, and that is the further out you go from the information that's available, then the harder and harder it gets. And that depends on the nature of your business and your operation and your partners and your size and a number of other things. So, for instance, the data that you need to do those certain calculations that rely on the longest distance to, that supplier of information. That could be from could be a travel provider, it could be from logistics, especially downstream, I would say, especially around like end of life of the products tends to be hardest because once they leave your factory, unless you're making like a really unique piece of equipment, like medical equipment or something, where you know exactly where it goes and how it's used. But if it's anything that goes out to consumers eventually, then you don't really know where that product ends up or how it's used
mm.
ultimately. And so that's probably one of the most challenging things on a detail level.
Thank you, Ben. Uh, Going back to that, I'm pretty sure you've interacted with so many people across your years of experience. Is there anything that, they have told you that has helped them in while they were doing this scope 3 inventory, or like from our conversations that we heard from our colleagues?
I think knowing that, and you'll hear this very soon as we talk about this from some of our guests, is that knowing that it's a process that it continues to evolve. Even the standards, if you're following SBTI, setting targets for Science-Based Targets Initiative or others, every so often they'll come out with a new standard, a new process, and so that'll change things. Emissions factors tend to evolve over time. Not all of them, but some of them. Assumptions and methods can evolve over time. The the importance of one area or over another can evolve over time. So those are all things you don't really have control over. Plus, internal to your operation, it changes. Like during COVID, for instance, we saw this massive spike in a lot of businesses. Could be up, could be down, uh, and so that changed the dynamic of what the numbers were. And so there are things that can happen all the time. So just know that um, it's something that every year it's going to get better, but you don't have to be perfect in the beginning. And even 10 years down the line, it's not going to be perfect necessarily, but it's going to get better than it was the prior years.
Mm.
And I guess, Joshua, from my perspective, I think you have a really good understanding of the frustrations of doing something complicated like Scope 3 accounting, especially when you don't have all the tools and data that a professional might, need to be successful in that. So on a personal level, and I know you've looked into this in some other ways, the behavioral piece, how do you think people can deal with the intensity and the stress, to avoid really getting overwhelmed? Any
Yeah.
observations or ideas from your perspective?
I think this reminded me of the last discussion we had in our webinar, where we were discussing about how important it is, especially when you're dealing with something as intensive, as big as Scope 3 emissions inventory, is to detach yourself from the task, to know that, you know, it is a task that you're carrying out for the organization. Yes, it's important. Yes, it's going to have an impact once you measure it so that you can effectively reduce it. But it's not your personal responsibility. Rather, it's something that you're doing for the organization. I think, yeah, detaching yourself from that is very important because once you start feeling like it's your personal responsibility, it's like a big problem that you have on your shoulders to solve entirely on your own. Because oftentimes sustainability professionals have very limited support. Uh, so I remember you mentioning also own the problem, sorry, own the solution and not own the problem. So yeah, own the
Right.
solution of tracking it and do the best as much as you can with the resources that you can pull in.
Hmm.
But it's very important for you to, detach yourself and say that this is something I'm doing it for someone and it's not your personal responsibility to track it. Because once you take it as your personal responsibility, I think it becomes too much. And that's when you get overwhelmed because you feel like, oh, I'm alone left to
Yeah.
face it.
That's right. We might run out of time on this podcast, but perhaps on a future one, I'll call it governance or at least executive support for it. One of the things you just mentioned that reminds me is, if you're doing it on your own and you're trying to get everyone else to participate, especially across departments, which you would have to do to be successful in the Scope 3 inventory, is sometimes like, well, why and what's important, and getting that executive level sponsorship and people knowing that
Hmm.
yes, we have to do it because we have reporting obligations or we need to set targets, we have our own sustainability. But again, I think it's also important to make sure that people communicate effectively that we have some operational upside to this too. It's not just, well, we have to check the box and we do spend this effort for months and then it just goes away and then, never to be seen again for another, year when we have to do it again. So I think using that information to find opportunities is something important too. And that can be challenging because by the time you get done with it, it's like, we're done. I don't want to look at those numbers again. But ultimately, they're intended globally to be used beneficially, not just to do the numbers. Just like accounting, if you think of an accounting uh, effort at the year end, you see how you did on a profit and loss statement and a balance sheet. The point is like, how can we do better, right? How can we save cost here? How can we make more money there? How can we expand our share? You can't really know that without having the baseline. So same
Hmm.
thing on an inventory.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think getting that executive support and especially pushing it down towards the organization to, like, let them know the importance and communicating in a way that they also find it relevant to their own, departments, their own roles is very important. It's a very hard task. Like you said, it's a own topic of its own,
Yeah.
but like a very important, crucial one indeed.
Yes.
Ben, would you like to share what our colleagues shared with us now? Like,
Yeah, I think it's probably a good time. We spoke with two of our contacts that have recently completed a Scope 3 inventory. Um, And I'd love to share. We had some input from Ash Sparks on their recent GHG inventory from New Belgium Brewing. She's worked for New Belgium for about a year, and she'll provide an intro. I was not able to join live, unfortunately, because of scheduling conflicts, but I did have a good conversation with her, brief conversation, and have that recorded, which I'm going to share from earlier this week. And I think it's really interesting to see her perspectives on a few of these questions that we're asking ourselves, so others can hear that front hand. So I'm going to try to share this. Hopefully, it's going to go
Yeah.
well. And let's see.
New Belgium Brewing as the environmental data analyst. I handle all of our greenhouse gas accounting for scope 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, I've been in this role since October, so pretty fresh, but I handled our accounting this past year and all of our reporting. So yeah,
Okay. Big responsibility
for
to jump
sure.
into a. How long did it take this most recent Scope 3 inventory? I know it's probably your first time through, but interesting to know how long it took.
Yeah, for scope 3, started it in February, finished it up in April, so took quite a while. I think some of that is definitely doing it for the first time for New Belgium, and just learning where all of the data lives. But additionally, to the theme of this webinar, scope 3 is a beast, so it just takes a long time as well.
Yeah, exactly. And what's funny is that's actually not as long as it would be for some that haven't done an inventory before. So probably seems long, but I guess from your perspective, like, where did you start since it was new to you and every year, I'm sure, you have to gear up. Like, where do you get started with all that?
Yeah, I think the specific process of the reporting, while went from February to April, it's kind of an all year gearing up for it, trying to improve data collection processes, make sure that we stay up to date with any changes that happen within our value chain that are relevant to our Scope 3 emissions reporting. And so where we start, I would say that it's just more of like kind of a continuous relationship with ensuring that data quality for us specifically, we're working on automating a lot of our data. And so that kind of looks like a lot of like QA on the data itself, a lot of cleansing, working with the relevant partners to make sure that we have the correct information. And yeah,
Yeah, great. Yeah, that makes sense. Get yourself organized and ready and then see where you can connect, make it easier. What
definitely.
kind of lessons did you learn during the process this time?
Yeah, this past year, I would say documentation is everything. I think not only does documentation ensure that your company has audit readiness in the event that assurance is ever something that the company wants to pursue, but additionally, I think documentation really um, supports with a repeatable approach to reporting year over year so that you can also do that analysis year over year. So I'd
Right.
say,
It's
yeah,
interesting.
documentation.
Yeah. It's funny, in our last podcast on sustainability best practices and how to avoid burnout, most of the folks that said that one of the tricks or the tips was to really be organized and diligent about the documentation and the rest to keep
Yeah.
yourself ready to go. So glad to hear that as another reinforcement.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I think specifically to documentation, like I think it really helps support with that burnout aspect because you only you're doing this reporting once a year, and so you're not getting the repetition to remember exactly how you did it or why you did it. And so if you can document those processes and come back to it a year later, it kind of supports the flow of getting it done.
yeah, totally. Was there anything that was easier than you thought or harder than you thought going into it?
Yeah. It's funny to use the term easy when talking about scope 3 reporting. I don't know if any of it feels easier than expected. I do think that just kind of that theme around documentation does make it a little bit more, you learn things every year that you do the process. And so when you can kind of document those new learnings and findings, it makes it easier the next year when you go back to do the task. And then additionally, I think we're in a really interesting time with AI tools becoming more available to support with some of those tasks that support with reporting, whether that be data cleansing or data organization. And so I think this year there was a little bit of like those tools available to support with that process. I think in years that follow, that will only become more prevalent. and make the process even easier. But I think harder, there's this past year, there were some significant updates to the emissions factors that we use because the methodology changed. And so trying to figure out what that means for our baseline year and potential needed revisions can be really challenging. I just think that that's a testament, though, to where the state of greenhouse gas reporting is. I think there will every year the frameworks will change, the standards will change, the emissions factors will change, and it'll develop and it'll improve. But that does make it really difficult to do year-over-year analysis. And I think it's great that those standards always continue to develop, but it just kind of adds another element to making Scope 3 a difficult task.
Right. Yeah, I can see how that as a baseline in comparison, you're trying to show a trend, but if the method changes or the emissions factor, then
Sure.
can mess up the trend either one way or the other. I guess
Sure.
that sort of leads into our final question, which is overall, if we look at the analysis piece and the reporting piece, like what do you think is the most challenging, either between those two or within either one?
Yeah, I think that this is a sentiment that a lot of companies can share, but just data quality and access, both for the activity data and for the emissions factors. Our company has built out some really great processes and relationships for obtaining data to support with Scope 3 reporting. And as we discussed earlier, New Belgium's been doing greenhouse gas reporting for a while now. But even with those processes, you still need to critically review the data for accuracy. And with the volume of data that goes into creating a Scope 3 report, it can be really consuming to do that data review and that critical review. And then additionally, if there's any corrections needed, that adds time to the process. And then, yeah, it can be really challenging and time consuming to procure relevant emissions factors. Thinking about categories 1 and 2, if you use the average database method, it can be really time consuming to find the relevant emissions factors for your business. And sometimes there's also a cost associated with those emissions factors and the licenses to access them. And that can just create another barrier to getting Scope 3 done. So,
Okay. Yeah, thanks. And then at the end, it occurs to me at this New Belgium, like at the end of this process, do you guys have a ceremony to celebrate somehow the end of the right, the end of the
yeah.
inventory?
Yeah, there is definitely a celebratory what we call a shifty. So going down and grabbing a beer to celebrate at the end of the workday when we finally hit submit on it. It's a good feeling for sure.
Nice. That's amazing. I love it. Something
Yeah,
maybe others can implement as well, some way to recognize the
for
completion.
sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
Well, I think that was a great conversation with Ash.
Yeah, yeah, it does sound like a great conversation.
I think one of the things to keep in mind for them, and we didn't mention it there, but they've been doing GHG inventories for about 15 years,
Hmm.
roughly, plus or minus. So when she talks about having refined the process and continuing to improve it and having challenges, while she is new to the organization as well, and we've helped over the years with some of those processes, is I mean, it just continues to evolve. So when you says he's got challenges that things are working, know that 15 years in of doing this, there's still ways to improve. But I also love the end of the process recognition because I think going back, Jyoshitha, to your point earlier about beating burnout and being recognized, I think sometimes we just get done and you just basically fall across the finish line, and then you move on to the next thing and ready to go. But I think it's important to commemorate because it is such a big effort, and it's fun when an organization like that really has an internal way to celebrate milestones with a
Yeah,
beer.
yeah, no, I agree. I think it's very important. It's you feel that joy when you click submit, and it's important to soak in that joy for that evening and like celebrate it as much as because you worked for it for all
Mhm.
these months.
Yep.
Um, so the first thing that I also found interesting, apart from the celebration thing, was how she said it took about 2 to 3 months to finish the inventory. And that's with you saying that they've, done it over the years, they've refined their processes. And especially if you include the time that they have taken to prepare, like be it data collection or like any preparation that they need, it's so much more longer. It also sets that realistic timeline for, our audience, or like even for myself, to know that Scope 3 inventory does take a lot of time and effort to prepare for it and just fill it out. But from Ben, what do you think? Is that a realistic time frame, like 2 to 3 months to do your inventory?
I would think that most companies would be thrilled if it only took 2 to 3 months. I
Oh,
think that's really on the outlier on a short side. I think most companies, and it's because if they have something that is that really they they've got everything organized, they're set, it's mostly internal, they've done it a lot, they know what they're
hmm,
doing, they have things coded. You heard Ash talk about the fact that they are also having uh, the opportunity to like automate things.
yeah.
I mean, that's the best case, right? Because everyone has 15 items. You need to get the data, you need to clean it, you need to work through it. And the bigger your team is, or if you're using, third-party support or others, there's back and forth, and some of the things are out of your hands and you're waiting. So I would say probably 2 months for sure is aspirational, um, that you could get it done that fast. I mean, I've seen them take early days 9 months. I mean, a long time because
Oh,
everything was new and everyone was trying to figure it out. They didn't have the data, and folks that we're working with aren't really familiar with how to sort things out because they just didn't know that business or something else related to the data. So probably 4 months, I'd say, would be from start to finish would probably be realistic planning, but that could
hmm.
depend on the entity. I think with software platforms and with teams getting more experienced and having done it a few times, that time frame a little bit shorter is probably about right.
Hmm. Okay. I thought 2 to 3 months was long, but okay, the realistic timeline is way longer. But it's nice to know that so that you know
Yeah.
how to plan accordingly and like set realistic expectations for yourself so that you don't, crunch on it.
Yeah.
But also, speaking of, the process evolving over time, with experience, I noticed how Ash mentioned documentation is the key. Document
Yeah.
everything. It's something that we have heard from time and time again, especially in the previous webinar that we hosted. Um, because Scope 3 is such a long process, especially if it's a process that you're going to be carrying out over like 5 or 6 months. Most likely is that you're going to learn so many things as and when you do it. But by the time you do it the next time, it's most likely you're going to forget the things that you learned, or like where you gathered the data from, who did you approach. And it was really, I think, a good tip that she said document everything, right from where did you get the data from, who did you contact, how did you manage to do it.
Mhm.
Because the next time when you do it, you'll have something as a base that you can build upon.
Right.
Uh, Plus, I think it's also going to help you, reduce your, like the personal side of things of burnout, because you don't have to start from scratch every time. And you can also maybe track your progress year over year to see how you've improved that.
Yeah, I think there are a few things there that are really important to keep in mind. If you think about documentation, there's really two aspects of it. One is the raw data sources
Mm,
and the content that you pulled. You want to make sure you have those because one is if you have an audit or you have assurance review or internally you have QA on that process. Um, that's super important to have it because you need to have that documentation for someone to look at. But then also as you're going back from a prior year to a prior year, if there's turnover, there's something new, or you're like, where do we get that thing again? Or what? You go to your AP department, your accounts payable department, and say, I need this information on vendors for category one. And they're like, well, what did we send you last year? Because they might not know either. And so you could give them an example of the thing. I was like, oh yeah, okay, now we can find it. So there's a lot of reasons why the data is important. And then the second piece, which you were also mentioning, is the methods and assumptions. So what do we do with that to actually
mm,
convert it into the GHG calculations? And that is also super important because from an assurance and review perspective, same thing. But then you can see next year and next year and next year, did we use the same assumptions? How are they changing? If we find a new method or a new emissions factor or a new way to interpret the data that came in. Maybe if it wasn't complete, then you could maybe update your method in a following year. But as Ash mentioned, that you might have to go back and restate a prior year because something changed. So you'd know like, oh, 3 years ago on our baseline year, we did it this way. If we're going to change that, we can see what implication it might have. So we would know how to change the baseline. There are a lot of reasons why that's important. And all that in addition to just being able to go start afresh, 9 months later and not have to start from scratch. So the tons of reasons why. And it's the level of effort to do it that way is only a fraction of the one-time effort that's required when you don't have it and you have to go figure it out. I can guarantee you every time that if you go back and try to find that data when you need it, and you will at some point, then it's going to take you, 5x, 10x the amount of time it would have taken just to leave the right documentation behind. So it's well worth it.
Yeah, yeah. It's so insightful to hear, lessons learned from people who have recently finished their inventory.
Yes.
It's so insightful because these are the things I feel like no standard or protocol is gonna tell you. It just comes from experience, and it's so insightful to hear that. When you also had a chance to speak with one of your other contact, what did they have to say about their experience?
Right. Yeah, I spoke with Kyle King, who is at Coca-Cola Northeast. So that's a Coca-Cola bottler, and I'm going to share some comments. So in advance of this podcast, we did reach out to some contacts, and I think everyone just completed their inventories. They're all taking a break right now, so they weren't able to join in person. But super happy to share. He wanted to share just like Ash did, with others because they see the importance of that camaraderie and what's happening across the board. And so we asked him a few questions as well that I think are relevant. He wasn't able to do a recording with us, but we did have a conversation with him. And we started this similar question, like where did he start with the process? And what his comments were, as you can see, is basically understanding all those 15 categories and how are they applicable to your operation, meaning not all of them are directly applicable. So you want to look through those and what's needed, right? So first get a lay of the land. What do we need? What's in there? And then for each of those different areas, there's different levels of granularity that's possible within each category. So you want to understand what that is and where to get them from your department. So come up with a game plan. Here's the 15 areas. Here's what we need from each area, and here's how we're going to get that. I think that's super important overall. In terms of lessons they learned, and we've heard this now, we've talked about this a little bit, is it's going to be an iterative process. Every year, something new, something different. It's all about making the calculations better. So don't feel bad about that, I think is a key thing. But also, don't underestimate the time it takes to get external data. And so we talked just a minute ago about the time frame. And if you're going to any third parties, internal or external, other departments, service providers, get detail. When you get activity-based information from vendors like miles traveled or weight or volume or something else, sometimes it can take a while for them to provide that to you. So just make sure you're building that in. And then I think, a third area here is what seems most challenging for scope 3 analysis, and or reporting. And his thoughts or comments were the data collection piece, the raw data, getting that raw data, getting it reliable, getting it accurate, making sure that it's right, and that it's usable for what your intended purpose of the calculation. That's the hardest part. He says, after that, it's not that hard to apply the emissions factor once you know what you have and you've got the data. So, but figuring out where to get it, who has it, is it correct? That's key. And then, as we just heard from Ash as well, similar is that year-over-year changes to methodology can really require an adjustment to the baseline values, or you have something to explain. Let's start that way. You just change because you change the methodology, or maybe you have better data, more complete data, that can make your numbers go up or down relative to a prior year, relative to a baseline year. And that can create some communication challenges, right? Oh, well, look, we went up by 10%, but it's okay because it's just a change in method. Or we went down by 20%. That's amazing. But really, we didn't because it should have been lower initially. And so balancing that is important. I think, as I mentioned before, during COVID, we saw that a few times where on the negative side is that, some folks' business sort of dropped off the cliff, right? There were certainly a lot of industries that went way down. And so their footprint went way down as well because it's activity based, right? If your business
Yeah.
goes down by 25%, it might not be proportional, but that absolute value would go down by a lot. And they're like, yay, look at this. We're down, but wait a minute, hold on. You don't want to maybe, claim that yet because when your business goes back up, which it did, then it looks like, oh, wait a minute, we celebrated too early. And it wasn't because it's a change in intensity.
Mm.
It was because it was a change in activity that was going to rebound. And same with the other direction. Some folks went way up during that period, and so it's like, oh no, this is terrible. But then average intensity maybe actually went down because sometimes the scale can help you.
Mm. For me, it's interesting to see the similarities in both Ash's and Kyle's answers, where when Kyle said, data is the key, gathering data, where to get it, who to get it, and like how do you get it, and that directly I feel it correlates to Ash's point about documenting everything, so that the next day when you come across that, you know the answers to it at least in some level, and also about how both of them said it's an iterative process that it's gonna get better and better over time, that it's just because the process just keeps evolving. So yeah,
Right.
that was really interesting to hear what people have like learn through people's experiences firsthand.
Yeah,
um
absolutely.
yeah. But I would like to flip the coin now, Ben, because we have heard great insights from people who have done the inventory, and they understand its importance. But have you interacted with clients or like people who have failed to realize the opportunities that comes from understanding their scope 3 emissions?
Yeah, I think what's important here is that when you understand scope three and all those categories at a real detailed tactical level, it's activity based. You know the business. You know the decisions that you make. You know about the products you manufacture. You know about the resources that you use and the intensity of those resources. You know the net impact on the environment you have, and you know where the opportunities are for improvement. So what's amazing is that when you are in this role and you see all that and you understand it, then you have visibility. I can guarantee you that no one else in that organization has. Not the
Mm.
CEO, not the COO, no one in like product manufacturing. Nobody sees all that because it's just not part of their day job, not part of their focus. They're focusing on the one group of metrics that are related to their function. Even the CEO is, high level. And so once you see those, you get to see how they're interrelated, what are the drivers. And so it really creates an interesting way to see what's happening, both in terms of material use and energy use and end of life impact. And so it creates actionable insight. It can, I think, when it's done properly. And so ultimately, this should not just be about reporting to others. Yes,
Mm.
you need that for maybe CDP reporting. Yes, you need it for your SBTI annual reports. Maybe you need it for some key customers that are asking for that data. But if that's all you do, you're really missing a huge opportunity to really help leverage the business. And I'll just say that as a sustainability professional, that means you have insight that others don't, but that's not really your purview. That's not your role. So you do need to find a partner or partners in the organization that you can
Mm.
work with to help talk through those things. If you're doing it on your own little island, it's still,
Yeah.
you may have that insight, but you don't have a partner to help really do anything about it.
Yeah, that really highlights the importance of synergy and the organization coming together when it comes to sustainability related things. Because it impacts the whole business and it's not one person's job, is it?
No, definitely not. It's a team. It's always a team effort.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh, I'd like to also go back, when you showed when like the first initial discussion we were having, where you said how oftentimes scope 3 is taken or like used synonymously with supply chain. Like
Mhm.
obviously it gives you insight into your supply chain, but it's not a synonymous term.
Mhm.
But coming back here, scope 3 does, involve you or require you to build relationships across your value chain.
Mhm.
So building upon the answer that you just said, what kind of value does this particularly add for the business and just for scope 3 accounting in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. The overlap there is while we're talking about scope three inventory, and you're right, the supply chain and value chain, if you think of everything outside of your operation, there are a lot of different ways to conceptualize what we're talking about here. And those all mean different things to different people too. So it's not the same. The relationships, though, I think that's a great question. When we do something like a double materiality assessment and you reach out to your stakeholders, this is a little different but related. You're reaching out to your suppliers, you're reaching out to your customers, you're reaching out to anyone else really that's material to your operation internally and externally. When you do that and you ask them for what's important to them and you share what's important to you as the prime mover in that conversation, what you find is there's a lot more alignment than you might realize, right? In your value chain, they do as well have targets and goals oftentimes, or they have the need to set targets and goals. They might not have them, but they certainly, everybody's got the need if they haven't to set targets and goals. And so when you come together, just like we're talking about sustainability professionals, in a number of different industries, knowing that you're not alone, is that also across your value chain, those other entities are trying to do something similar. So when they know that you're doing something and you know they're doing something towards maybe reducing the footprint or understanding what's happening, that can be very beneficial. And I think that relationship is important. And you rely on them ultimately, right, to take action because you don't own their business. You can't tell them exactly what to do. You can request them to do
Yeah.
things. You can encourage them, but you need that relationship. So the relationships is really important. And if you look at the scope three assessment more as a understanding what's happening in terms of activities and volumes across your whole value chain, that's where it's an interesting conversation because I can tell you everyone else in your value chain wants to increase their business, wants to
Hmm.
increase their profit, and for the most part wants to improve on their sustainability and environmental impact. So, which
Yeah.
is the same thing you would want to do too in your business. So it's a good conversation to have.
Do you also think it in some way helps build in supply chain resilience, or does it not?
No, I think the relationships are huge, right? If something happens to a supplier that you don't know about, you want them to feel comfortable reaching out.
Hmm.
If something happens to a customer and they need more from you, then you want to have that relationship. On your logistics, super important, right? Maybe something happens, weather related or infrastructure related. You want to make sure you have that team effort. I think that is, absolutely the case. The better relationship you have, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to see your way through issues when they come up. I think a related thing as you're working with suppliers is understanding, how they're planning for resilience and risks that are coming up. And there are frameworks, whether it's in Europe or UK, and in selected states in the US, and then Singapore and other markets that are having more requirements to understand what those risks are and the environmental impact in your supply chain, just because they know that that's 85 to 95% of the total impact is coming from that value chain at large. So yes, I think resilience, not only just the tactical piece of the relationship, but then, using that as a springboard to understand more about how they're preparing for risks, it
Hmm.
is important too.
I think this is again a whole other topic by in itself, like how do you build supply chain resilience? But yeah, I
So
can see
definitely,
how it is really correlated and how one helps the other.
right. Yeah, we'll definitely have another podcast on that topic that's changed
Yeah.
on its own.
I want to pivot here a bit, Ben. So, for someone who's just entered the field, and if they handed out the responsibility of Scope 3 accounting, they have no reference point, they have don't know where to start, no team. Where would you suggest they first look into, and where do you suggest they start from?
Well, I'm going to echo what we heard from Ash and also from Kyle, which is like look at those 15 categories, understand for your business at a
Hmm.
detailed level how they apply. I think that's super important because it's something that that's going to guide your effort. And if you take that chart or a version of it that we had that we showed earlier and said, okay, where's the data going to come from? Is it applicable to us? What level of granularity do we need, or do we think we can get? And organize your efforts around that, and begin to have some communications with the different other sources of that data. I mean, that's the best place because you can't just dive into one and get going because then you'll lose track. That's maybe each one has its own challenges. So you need to also balance those. I found over time that if you just do one and another one in serial, one after another, not
Hmm.
parallel, then it's going to take forever because each one is going to have its own challenges. And by the time you get done with that one, you start the new one, and that's going to have time. You really need to work with them all in parallel in some ways. But if you're not organized, then that whole thing just torques shut. So you want to make sure you're doing it organized. Yeah,
Okay, so understanding what categories matter to your organization is the first step. But
I
would you
think so.
say,
Yeah.
okay, but would you say if there are any categories that's the easiest to start with in terms of gathering data? Or like,
Um, I think the ones that you already have access to the data itself because they're derived. So the things like category three, that's fuels, upstream fuels and energy emissions, that's something that's derived from what you already have in scope one and two. That's sort of an easy one to check off. It's an easy one to get through, fairly straightforward. Um, if you want to say we did something this week, that's someone you could do first week, as long as you have scope one and two already done. And then a few others. I think it depends on the nature of your business. Maybe you have, you maybe have one site, and so the employee commuting bit that comes through is fairly easy. Maybe you have a lot of sites, so that's going to take more time if you don't have the data. Those kind of things I think are good places to start. But um, you need to begin to request the big things like category one is all of your vendor and supplier data. And so that's going to have to come from your accounts payable department usually, or finance or accounting, depending, how you're structured. And so that's something that you're going to need to get that ball rolling quickly to sort through it. And you heard Kyle mention that in Ash a little bit as well.
hmm, okay. So I'd like to go to the next step now. So now, once you have the data across multiple categories that's relevant to your organization, how would you say one brings it together for an inventory or a report?
Yeah, when we're talking about reporting, there's the functional piece, which is here's the numbers, there are 15 categories, here's the total in each category, and roll it up in a grand total for scope three and combine that with one and two. That's super functional. It's data, it's structured, and you're going to provide that maybe in a table at the end of your sustainability report. You're going to maybe, of course, you have to publish that for SBTI every year. You have to maybe put it into your CDP reporting or others. Okay, fine. Like that piece, external, very functional. But ultimately, for the internal stakeholders and where you're trying to move the needle and make a difference, is it needs to be digestible. It needs to be something that for those people who aren't deeply embedded, who aren't familiar with every topic, who are not familiar with how it all works, needs to be relevant to them and they need to be understandable. Um, and so it needs to be and it needs to be presented in a way that can be used to help them understand like what does it mean and what might they do to reduce their impact. If you just say your department is responsible for, I'll make up the number, 10,000 metric tons of CO2e, you need to reduce it. They're like, well, I don't even know why or how. Like, what does that even mean? Right.
Hmm.
And so it needs to be broken down as something that's useful for them. So I think that's super helpful. And you can do that in different ways. You can break down the numbers. You can maybe show it in, some sort of custom format using a tool of some sort or a reporting platform that exists out there to visualize, but ultimately you need to know what your stakeholders do, what they need to be informed, and then how do you make sure it's relevant for them.
Hmm. Okay. I think the next question I would ask is, okay, now you have your inventory. Like I said, if it's your first time reporting, from conversations from inputs we've heard from Kyle and Ash, it's an iterative process. So it's not gonna be a look perfect. But to make it as perfect as possible, is there any tips that you'd give to address those data gaps that you'd have in your inventory if it's your first year?
I think finding others or making sure you have someone that's qualified to know what good looks like, I guess I would say. If you're saying like, how do you know it's going to be okay, enough, right? Perfection, yes, that's never going to happen in this because you're relying on a lot of calculations and estimations and assumptions and methodology that, yes, each one is okay, but from your experience, Yoshida, and in training for GHG protocol, there's what's ideal and then there's what's real. And
Yeah.
there's a very big gap in almost every category between those two, just because reality sort of gets in the way of the ideal. So first is understanding like what is good look like, what does correct look like, and having someone either internal or maybe external help you figure that out is important because then you won't really know, otherwise you wouldn't know if it's good. And so getting to that stage first is important. And then, as you heard from a couple of other guests, is making sure that the data that comes in is complete, making sure it's accurate, doing some testing on it, making sure that it seems reasonable, like the base information, getting the data is reasonable. So, because then when you do the calculations on it, everything sort of tends to flow
Mm.
fairly quickly, but the source data, that's key. And so I think making sure you have good sources and they all seem reasonable and the appropriate level of detail, that's really going to make everything, go better.
Mm. Before I ask the next question, when you said, the difference between ideal and what's practical, it reminded me of something. Because I've just come out of university less than a year ago, when we were learning about GHG protocol, it's so different from what I am learning on the field about implementing it. Because when you're in university, they teach you, oh, so here's the protocol, this is scope 3 reporting, you learn about the categories, you learn about and on some level, how do you calculate it? But then when I entered the field, when I started practicing it, is when I realized, oh, it's way harder than you think it is. Because when you're in university, your data is given to you, but
Mm,
the real challenge is going and collecting the data and not doing the actual calculation. Because you have to find out which sources are reliable, where do you go for that data, and then once you get back, you have to check if it meets your quality standards. And yeah, I think it there's a very drastic, bridge that has to be built to bridge ideal versus what's the reality.
yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I mean, you got your master's degree, so don't undersell the experience you have. You got an amazing set of experience and background in these things. And I think other folks that have been working in the field similarly. But yeah, it's like if someone showed you an itinerary where they took a trip to some place that you've never been before. They said, "Look what
Mm.
I did. I went to this hotel and I did this. I flew there and everything was great." And you're like, "Well, I want to do that trip." And then you realize, wait a
Yeah.
minute, like where should I stay? And is this okay or not? And what about the different travel arrangements? And when I get to the airport, um, like how do I get ground transportation? Do I take the train or a taxi or a Uber? And like, does Uber even exist in that market? And how much is it going to cost? And where am I going to go? And then is it safe? And how much should I bring with us? And should what plug do I have? All these things, right? That you
Yeah.
wait a minute, it seems easy. And then on the travel brochure, then wait a minute, it's actually fairly complicated once you get in and it's not perfect. So yeah, I think that's right. It's when you dig in. That's why having someone to discuss the topics with or an experienced person that can help make sure that it's appropriate is
Mm.
good. And even if it's just like, okay, does this seem right or not? And that could be in the form of sort of platformatic or internal or peers or whatever. There's a lot of different ways to find that. Um, and for me, that's one of the fun things when we do that work is to help cross-pollinate, right? People are like, well, I haven't run into this before. Well, here's someone else that has, and so
Mm.
here's something you might want to try to work towards that, or we could help do that piece where you want to sort of knock it out.
Yeah, yeah. But going to my next question, once they know what good looks like, what does getting better every year look like? Like, how do they know that, or how do they keep track of that?
Yeah, I think we start every time with its own with a fresh pair of eyes. I like that term as I was looking at fresh pair of eyes, like how do we do it? We're doing it right, continuing to challenge yourself. And we talked earlier about having the right documentation and the sources so you can continue to find ways to build it. And I think if you once you complete the first one, even the second one or the fifth one or the 10th one, whatever the cycle is, you realize like what could we have done better? And how can we embed that closer to the data itself? So, for instance, category one is a really big one with all the vendor spend. And so, if you're using a coding system, like to give them a NAICS code or some sort of standard industrial classification that you're using to do like spend-based accounting, for instance, and you realize like you're doing that outside of the accounts payable system, you can push that back and say, well, we have this already coded. Let's push it back, that data back into like the source. And then that way, every time we get the data next year, it'll already be sort of pre-coded. Same way with reports, maybe from a third-party logistics provider. Maybe you dialed it in and said, well, if we have this, this, and this piece of information broken down this way by market, then it's going to be much faster. So then if you can give that back to the supplier, the logistics provider, and say, hey, can you create this report for us so next year we can run it? And so I'll say it's not exactly automation, but process improvement, back not just for you doing your job, but can you help all those other stakeholders that have a role make it easier to do? So I think
Mm.
that's key.
Yeah, I think that's also more efficient, isn't it? Like if you whatever the quality that you want to improve, if it's pushed to the source data, if it's just gonna make the process more efficient over time.
Right. And that's better all around, right?
Yeah.
Helps improve data quality, helps improve the time. I think, Joshua, what's exciting for me is we have, I'll say, scratched the surface on this beast. We've taken we know what the beast is now, and I think there's so much more that we can talk about going forward, and I hope that we'll get some additional great feedback from the audience over time, and we'll continue to dive into more details. But I also don't want to bore people by having to listen to a super long podcast. But I think at this point we've covered a lot of topics, and I think we can definitely dive into some of these in more detail, depending on what folks that are listening think we should work on.
Yeah.
Good.
No, I agree. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was a great conversation overall. I think I learned a lot of things, and I'm pretty sure our audience have as well. So yeah, thank you, Ben. We're gonna wrap this podcast up. Like we said, we don't wanna keep the podcast too long because we wanna tease a bit so that we have more and more things coming up. So thank you everyone for listening. I hope you had gained some really useful insights from today's session. We want to keep creating sessions like this one. So if today was valuable to you, the biggest thing that you can do is join our ISTEP community where we plan for more such podcasts and events and spread the word about it. Thank you.